On Halloween 1975, the small elite community of Belle Haven, Connecticut was transformed from a safe-gated neighbourhood to a town of fear and suspicion when Martha's body was discovered. Martha, a 15-year-old schoolgirl, had been out with friends for Mischief Night, but failed to return home for her curfew. In the morning, a search party was formed to try and locate her. One of her friends en route to join the search found Martha on her parents' property. She had been savagely beaten and stabbed. This is the story of how her killer was eventually tried in 2002, and despite being found guilty, is now free. Why did it take over 25 years to identify the killer? Was a prominent family hiding one of their own? Or did the police investigation focus on the wrong suspect? Welcome to True Crime with Morty, a podcast by a criminologist and her dog. I am your host TJ, and this is Morty. Each week we'll be doing deep dives into murders and mysteries from all around the globe, using my background in law and criminology to give a full account of true crime stories. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing, and thank you for joining us today. This episode will be the first of a series focusing on the mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. To understand Martha's case, you need to understand her home at the time of the murder, the Jewel of Greenwich, Connecticut, a place called Belle Haven. Belle Haven is a wealthy gated community in Greenwich, Connecticut, positioned near Long Island Sound. Built in the 1880s, it was designed to be a secure neighbourhood for wealthy people to live safely in a beautiful area with its own private club and beach. Money magazine once ranked Greenwich as the best place to live in the United States, if one can afford it. Former residents include Kathy Lee Gifford, Ron Howard, Diana Ross, Dorothy Hamill, Joseph E. Levin, and Presidents George Bush Sr. and President Trump were frequently there, the former visiting his mother, the latter spending weekends with Ivana, and my personal favourite, the author of In Cold Blood, Truman Capote. Back in 1974, where our case begins, there was around 40 homes in Belle Haven that contained the American elite. On the surface, it was an ideal place to live. The residents were wealthy, successful, and privileged, living in one of the most expensive and beautiful postcodes in America. But there was an unusual amount of problems. In the 1994 book Greentown by Timothy Dumas, one of Martha's friends and fellow Belle Haven resident, Christy Kaplan, describes it as similar to the David Lynch film Blue Velvet, where the underbelly of the town is dark and chaotic compared to its perfect veneer. Belle Haven exemplified this things are not as they seem concept, as the wealth and beautiful facade of the homes hid personal problems and tragedies that led to dysfunctional family dynamics, particularly in the 1970s. There was an unusually high amount of accidental deaths and suicides, in addition to residents dying from terminal illness. Trauma and grief impacted mental health, which was medicated with alcohol and prescription pills. Many of the families were from generational wealth, or acted as figureheads of successful family businesses, where they didn't need to attend work daily or have much structure in their week. This meant that alcoholism was common, even for those who were not dealing with trauma. The families where at least one parent went to work were in the minorities, but nearly all the children were left to their own devices outside of school, regardless of where their parents were. Even in school, due to their privilege and well-connected families, there was not much energy placed on academic achievement or even good behaviour. This freedom and lack of boundaries had significant impact later when police were looking at the suspects in the Moxley case. The Moxley family moved to Walsh Lane, Belle Haven, in 1974 from Oakland, California. They were unusual in that they came from a more ordinary background than many of their neighbours. Martha Elizabeth Moxley was born on the 16th of August 1960 to parents Dorothy Moxley, a teacher and homemaker, and her father David Moxley worked at Touch, Ross & Company, who were an international consulting and accounting firm. The move to Belle Haven was due to David's promotion. He was managing the New York office in 1975. Dorothy had grown up in a very happy home in Detroit, Michigan. Her family didn't have much money, or even a bathroom. They used an outhouse, but it was a loving and almost idyllic childhood. Dorothy grew up to be a popular high schooler, member of the cheerleading squad, and she attended Michigan State University after she graduated. She then moved to California to pursue teaching, and it was during her early years of teaching that she met David. David Moxley was serving in the military when he met Dorothy. They married in March of 1956, after only knowing each other for a few months, and soon moved from California to Kansas so that David could complete his MBA. They lived in a small apartment supported by Dorothy's teaching salary while David studied. Then, in 1958, with his master's in hand and Dorothy pregnant with their eldest child, John, the Moxleys returned to California. Their life improved year on year. They didn't have much money to start, but it was growing, largely due to David being extremely intelligent and having a fantastic work ethic. He climbed the ladder at his company and was able to secure top positions. The only downside was that the roles caused him to travel a lot, while Dorothy was at home alone with John and Martha. As a child, Martha took ballet lessons and played the violin and piano. She loved animals, particularly cats and frogs. She grew up to be very happy and confident. Due to moving around a lot, her and her brother were very outgoing and made friends easily. Martha was known for her big personality. It's the one thing that comes up time and time again when people discuss her. It's how kind she was and that she had a wonderful sense of humour. By the time she moved to Belle Haven in 1974, Martha had blossomed into a beautiful and stylish teenager. She had long blonde hair parted in the middle, she was very pretty, and she loved fashion. She was into music and spending time with her friends. Her diary pages and letters indicate a girl who is a very typical teen. Her social life was very important. She was excited about boys and parties, worried about marks on her school tests. Martha and her brother John attended the local high school rather than the private schools favoured by their neighbours in Belle Haven, which gave them a wider circle of friends. Martha had met her boyfriend Peter DeLuca in the summer of 1975, the year after they moved to Greenwich, and Peter is quoted as saying it was love at first sight. He was in awe of Martha, where normally he was very confident around girls. The two were still dating in October 1975, and were due to have a date the night Martha died. Two Belle Haven families that we need to talk about in connection with Martha's death are the Ix family and the Skakel family. The Skakel home on 71 Otter Rock Drive was diagonally opposite Martha's house at 38 Walsh Lane. The Ix family home was opposite Martha's and next door to the Skakels. Next door neighbours was a relative concept. These were massive mansions with huge gardens and driveways. They weren't like terraced, semi or detached houses in a normal neighbourhood. There was a lot of space between them all, but essentially they all lived next to each other. The houses and street have changed a lot over the years, but by comparing maps from the 70s to now, you can piece together the general layout of the houses at the time of the murder. Bob Ix was the president of Schweppes, and he was married to Sissy. Their daughter, Helen Ix, was with Martha on the night of her death, along with another friend from the neighbourhood, Jeff Byrne. The Ixes were also close friends with the Skakels. Rushton Skakel Sr. and his late wife Anne were heirs to the Great Lakes Coal and Coke Company. The Skakels are in-laws of the Kennedys. Rushton's sister Ethel had married Senator Robert Kennedy in 1950, and is mother to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who'll be relevant in the later episodes. Martha was last seen alive at the Skakel home, and they are at the centre of this case, so understanding their household will help to understand the mystery. Rushton Skakel Sr. is one of 7 children of George Skakel Sr. and Big Ann Skakel. George started the Great Lakes Coal and Coke Company in 1919 with 2 friends, and while the Depression hit everybody else, he became a multi-millionaire. He turned the worthless byproduct of the oil and gas industries into a profitable business, as it was a component in the making of aluminium. George Skakel Sr. was very focused on growing his business and his company. The Skakels moved to Greenwich in 1934 to be closer to the company offices in the Empire State Building, and to take advantage of the lack of state income tax. George appears to have been quite removed as a parent, preferring to focus on building relationships with his clients, using hunting trips, playing golf, and throwing massive parties at his mansion on Lake Avenue. George and Big Ann died when their plane blew up in 1955, leaving their fortune and their company to their 7 children, 3 of whom are key in this story: Rushton Skakel Sr., George Anterian, and Ethel Kennedy. Rushton moved to Belle Haven with his wife, who is also called Anne, she's Anne with an E, in the 1950s. Much like his parents, they had 7 children, 6 boys and a daughter: Rushton Jr., Julie, Thomas, John, Michael, David and Stephen. Anne was the centre of the family, a very beloved wife and mother. She was very outgoing and sporty, she had a big personality. But she died after a horrible battle with cancer in 1973, when she was just into her 30s. She had been back and forth with the disease, and towards the end her illness had got so bad that she was confined to a hospital where she refused to see her children on the account of not wanting to traumatise them. Her death left a grieving and distraught Rushton to raise the 7 children alone, and he unfortunately struggled with the loss and his new responsibilities and favoured drinking over parenting, much like his own parents. Rushton Skakel Sr. is described by many as a generous and kind man, but it is alleged that his parenting was subpar, even when he was actively involved, and some of his generosity was believed to be more performative than sincere. The Skakels have a reputation for entitlement and a snotty attitude, often name-dropping their famous cousins, the Kennedys, which is odd given there's an ongoing feud which will be discussed in later episodes. One of the things that the Skakels have in common with their more famous cousins is their family is also believed to be cursed. More on that later too. For now, the most important people to remember are Rushton Skakel Sr. and 3 of his children, Julie, Tommy and Michael, as they are the most connected to Martha's case. The other person to mention in connection with the Skakel house is Ken Littleton. Ken had been hired by Rushton Skakel Sr. to tutor his children. Ken was a basketball coach and teacher at the Whitby School in Greenwich, which the Skakel boys had attended, and he'd been asked to live in and help with their education, and act as a sort of guardian when Rushton was away. He is not the only live-in member of staff, but he is central to this mystery as his first day of living in Belle Haven is the night Martha died. The mystery of what happened to Martha begins on Thursday the 30th of October 1975. It was an unusually cold autumn day. A sudden freeze had dropped temperatures overnight. But apart from the sudden weather change, the day started normal enough. Martha's father was away on business. David Moxley's new role still involved a lot of travel, and on the 30th of October 1975, he was in Atlanta at a meeting with other managers, while Dorothy was with the children in Greenwich. Martha and John had gone to school as normal. The next day was a teacher training day, and it was Halloween, so the students were excited for the longer weekend. Martha had permission to throw a Halloween party the next day, despite being grounded for coming home late the week before. She also had plans to visit Peter, her boyfriend, at his house and cook dinner for him on that Thursday night. However, at the last minute, Peter cancelled. He felt tired. He blames this on smoking too much weed at lunchtime, but all he wanted to do was go home and crash after school. Peter's last memory of Martha is at the student centre in the high school, and her being disappointed that they were not going to hang out. He promised to call her later. Peter went home and had a nap, ate dinner with his mother, but he never got a chance to call Martha as he had planned. Martha headed home with Sheila Maguire, another resident of Walsh Lane, on the bus. The girls stood in the rain and swirling leaves outside Martha's house, discussing their plans for the next day before departing to their respective homes. At 6:30 p.m, Martha is at home, and she's visited by Helen Ix and Jeff Byrne, and she asks her mother if she can go out with them around the neighbourhood for Mischief Night. Mischief Night is the night before Halloween, when there is some sort of prank tradition where they throw toilet paper and shaving foam and eggs. Remember this later as it's important regarding the suspects in this case. Although Martha is still technically grounded, she is allowed out until 9:30 p.m. around Belle Haven with her neighbours. So Martha, Helen and Jeff leave Martha's house at 6:30 p.m. to take part in Mischief Night, and eventually they arrive at the Skakel house at 8:45 p.m. Michael answers the door. As mentioned before, he is the 5th son of Rushton Skakel Sr. and Anne Skakel, and he's aged 15, the same age as Martha and Helen. They go out and listen to music in the Lincoln car parked in the driveway. Michael and Martha sat in the front seats, with Helen and Jeff behind them. Later on, Tommy Skakel, Michael's 17-year-old brother, comes to join them, and he gets into the vehicle and sits between Martha and Michael. According to witness reports, Tommy tries to put his hand on Martha's leg twice, and both times she moves it off. Michael asks her to come with him later to his cousin's house to watch Monty Python, and she declines as she needs to go home, and arranges to meet with him another time or day. This ambiguity will be relevant later. At 9:15, John Skakel, Rushton Skakel Jr. and Jim Terrian tell the children that they need the car to drive to Jimmy's house. Everyone exits the vehicle so they can get in, and Michael goes with them. The car leaves. Helen Hicks and Jeff Byrne go home and leave Tommy and Martha by the side door of the Skakel house talking. It is also mentioned in police reports that they are play fighting or messing around, and Martha fell. Tommy denies this, but either way, at 9:30 p.m, she's outside the Skakel home talking to Tommy when Julie Skakel and Andrea Shakespeare leave the house and walk down the driveway so that Julie can take Andrea home. When Julie gets into her car, she realises her car keys are missing, so Andrea goes back to the house and knocks on the front door. Tommy answers it. He has said goodbye to Martha and returned home to do his homework, leaving Martha to cross the Skakel driveway and onto Walsh Lane towards her own front yard, which is diagonally opposite. Tommy gives Andrea the keys and she heads back to Julie's car. Meanwhile, Julie is sat in her car waiting to go and sees a figure dash past her car. Instinctively, she thinks it's Michael and shouts at the figure, "Michael, come back here!" Not sure why she shouted this or thinks it's Michael when he's supposed to have already left in the Lincoln car to drive to the Terrians, but either way she shouts and the figure does not respond and carries on. Then Andrea returns with the car keys and they drive off. There are many variations of what I've just explained and we're going to deep dive into that. But for now, that is the rough timeline of events and where everybody was around 9 to 9:30, as the police understood it in 1975. So for now, we will talk about what happens next. Between 9:30 and 10 p.m, a lot of eerie things happened around Walsh Lane. First of all, 11-year-old Jeffrey Byrne was extremely frightened running home. He lived on Mayo Avenue, which was the next street over, behind the Skakel's property. He travelled along Walsh Lane and took what seems to be a tree-lined path, a shortcut, to get back there. He believed he was being chased or followed on his route and was spooked by it when he returned to his house. His father claims that night affected him. He was very shaken and was even more disturbed once he'd found out what happened to Martha. In addition to Jeff feeling unsafe, the neighbourhood dogs started to react strangely. Numerous neighbours reported their dogs, who were normally calm or only barked at certain things, were behaving like they were scared. They were barking loudly and ferociously for seemingly no reason. The owners all reported this as being at a similar time, around 9:45. There was no obvious explanation for it. The owners themselves say they were disturbed and nervous to go outside. Helen Hicks had returned home by then and her dog was outside barking ferociously towards the Moxley property. She attempts to go outside, but the Hicks's nanny stops her as she believed the dog was reacting to something dangerous. I apologise for the squeaking. Morty has found Mr. Fox. Charles Morganti, who was part of the private security team at Belle Haven, had also experienced an uneasy feeling that night. His shift was mostly normal, but there was something of a calm before the storm edge to the night that reminded him of another time he experienced an unexpected death. His night was not improved when he was sent to Walsh Lane to investigate a car accident. Someone had driven into the fence on Otter Rock Drive and knocked it down. While attending the scene, he saw what he describes as a mob of teenagers, around 12 or 13 children, who see him and run towards the Skakel house. Walking around Walsh Lane, he feels uneasy again and decides to drive around for a bit, presumably trying to find the cause of the fence damage. On his trip around Belle Haven, he sees a man who he doesn't recognise, a blonde-haired man in his 20s wearing glasses. The man insists he lives on Walsh Lane and is just out for a walk. 12-year-old Stephen Skakel wakes up to hear screaming coming from Walsh Lane at around 10 p.m. Sheila Maguire had spent the evening at a party and tried to connect with her crush, a situation set up by Martha, and unfortunately it hadn't gone well. Sheila returned home looking forward to being comforted by Martha about it on the following day, but for now Sheila had bigger problems, as sometime around midnight she'd arrived back home to find the house all locked up and everyone asleep. On brand for the parents of the neighbourhood, the Maguires sometimes lost track of their many children and hadn't realised she was still out. Initially, she tried sleeping in the car in the garage, but the combination of freezing cold weather and Sheila feeling unusually frightened and creeped out, she returned to her front door and banged on it until her mother Elvira woke up and let her in. The uneasiness of the night was also felt at the Moxley house. Between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m, Dorothy Moxley was painting the windowsill in her bedroom while waiting for her children to return. She heard noises outside that sounded like 3 teenage voices talking loudly or shouting. Dorothy could not hear what they were saying, or be certain how many of them there were, but the noise made her stop painting and look outside. Unable to see anything, she considered turning on the outside lights, but decided against it as Martha's new bike was on the porch and she was worried it would be stolen if the front garden was illuminated. Instead, Dorothy packed up her paint supplies and got ready for bed. She then headed downstairs to wait for John and Martha. 11 p.m, John returns to the Moxley house and goes to bed. He hasn't seen Martha as he's been out with other friends, and Dorothy starts to worry as Martha was due home before John. As mentioned earlier, Martha had been late home the week before, so at this point Dorothy thought this may well just be a repeat of Martha ignoring her curfew and decides to sit by the front door and wait. At some point she falls asleep and awakes at 1 a.m. Halloween morning, subconsciously aware that Martha isn't home. She goes to check her room just to confirm that she's not snuck back in, but no Martha. Dorothy is extremely concerned now and starts to call around the neighbourhood. She starts with the X household as Martha left with Helen. Helen explains that she parted ways with Martha at the Skakels at 9:30 p.m, where Martha was talking to Tommy Skakel. Dorothy calls the Skakel house and speaks to Julie, who asks Tommy where he last saw Martha. He says 9:30 p.m, make a note of that, it's a big clue later, and that she was going home. Julie relays this message and then suggests that Dorothy tries the Terrians in case Martha went there when her cousin and brothers left in the Lincoln. Dorothy is perplexed by this as Martha is supposed to be in Belle Haven and the Terrians live about 10 minutes away by car on Cliffdale Road, but she calls them anyway. She speaks to Georgianne, who is Rushton Skakel Sr.'s sister and Jimmy Terrian's mother. Georgianne has no idea what's going on. She had a few glasses of wine and went to bed, not really knowing where her grown-up sons were. She looks around her enormous house and can't find them, and there's no sign of Martha. Dorothy wonders if Martha is out with friends in Belle Haven, as the Skakel said she was walking home, and it's only a few minutes from the Skakel house driveway to the Moxley garden. Perhaps she met up with some other people who were out for Mischief Night? She wakes John up and asks him to drive around the neighbourhood to see if Martha or any other kids are still out. He phones a few more houses where kids have got together for parties, but no one has seen Martha. She calls the Saluka household, and Peter and his mother confirm that they haven't seen or spoken to Martha since Peter saw her at school. Sheila, now tucked up safely in bed, is woken up by her mother, who asks if she has seen Martha at the party. She confirms that last she heard Martha was going to Peter's house. Dorothy tells Maguires that Martha went out around Belle Haven instead, but she has failed to return. Sheila goes back to sleep untroubled. Martha is sure to be passed out at someone's house. She'll turn up. John returns from driving around Belle Haven and reports no signs of Martha. Dorothy has exhausted all her leads now and decides to call the police headquarters at 3:48 a.m. Donald Merchant is dispatched to Walsh Lane and a missing person report is filed. Officer Donald Merchant is immediately concerned about Martha, which is odd as it's less than 24 hours and Martha has stayed out late before. And police are often quite blasé early on in missing persons investigations as so many of them return very quickly. But Officer Merchant said that he felt something was off. His main alarm bell was seeing the party decorations that Martha had put up and realising the effort she'd gone to for her party the next day. He felt that given how distressed her mother was and how Martha had been in trouble the week before, that it seemed odd she would risk having this cancelled on a night where all the other kids were now at home and the streets were empty. He helped Mrs. Moxley search the house and some of the grounds, but they didn't see anything suspicious. He filled out a full missing persons report and local alarm for Martha and passed it on at the end of his shift. Dorothy Moxley spoke to the police again at 6:35 a.m. to confirm that Martha still hadn't returned, before heading over to the Skakels to try and get some answers. On knocking the door to the Skakel residence, she's greeted by Michael Skakel, who, according to Dorothy, looked pale and tired. Michael doesn't seem to know anything about the whereabouts of Martha, but shows Dorothy the inside of the camper van that is parked next to the house. No Martha. It is now Halloween morning, and Martha has been missing for almost 12 hours. The neighbours and parents that Dorothy contacted asking about Martha wake up and remember that Dorothy Moxley called about her daughter in the middle of the night. Cursory phone calls to confirm she has returned home cause shock and horror as the news spreads that Martha is still not back. John headed off to football practice Halloween morning, as at this point he still wasn't alarmed about his sister. He assumed all was okay and that Martha would be back, just in a lot of trouble. But Dorothy's friends were worried and started to descend on the Moxley house to support Dorothy and make phone calls. The neighbours started a search party. Belle Haven residents and sisters, Tori and Holly, arranged to meet Sheila Maguire to go to a favourite camping spot of the teenagers and check Martha didn't pass out there in a tent. The adults are ringing around the neighbourhood, checking that Martha hasn't crashed at someone's house. As it was bad weather the night before, it was really cold. It was possible then that Martha went to somebody's house and maybe passed out in front of a cosy fire. David Moxley is still in Atlanta on the morning of Halloween. Dorothy told him that their daughter hasn't come home, and he and his colleagues were calling regularly for updates. Sheila goes to meet Holly and Tori between Walsh Lane and Mayon Avenue, and decides to go through Martha's garden to reach Walsh Lane. Martha lived next door to Sheila and had a beautiful garden behind a high wall with a big iron gate that allowed access from the Maguire property. As Sheila enters the Moxley garden, she is distracted by the possibilities of what happened to Martha. The girls plan to search woods near Interstate 95, as the local teens often camp there. And Sheila is not massively concerned for Martha, as she feels the simple answer is she's passed out somewhere from partying. As she walks through the garden, Sheila noticed something strange under a large pine tree at the edge of the Moxley property. Initially, she wasn't sure what she was looking at and approached the tree. It seemed like maybe her brain had tried to distance her from the trauma, as she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing, and it was only as she got closer that she realised she was looking at Martha. Sheila became hysterical and ran into the Moxley house, saying she'd found Martha and that she was injured. Dorothy Moxley and her friends were alarmed, but Sheila reassured them that Martha was okay, just injured. It was decided that Dorothy's friend, Jean Walker, would go and check on Martha as something was clearly wrong. Jean went into the garden and found Martha under the pine tree. She knew immediately that Martha was deceased, but confirmed this by touching Martha's back. Jean returned to the house and broke the news to Dorothy, who was completely devastated. Her worst fears were confirmed and she was in complete shock. In an interview she did for the American Justice Program, she described hearing that Martha was dead. Quote, "I sat in a chair in the living room and I was afraid to move, because I knew if I moved, I would fall apart." End quote. The police were then called, and of course David Moxley had rung again for an update as he was waiting at the Atlanta airport. He was told to come home, and when he pressed for information about what was happening, he was told over the phone that his daughter was dead, and then he had to spend almost 3 hours alone on the flight back from Atlanta. It was his 44th birthday. Officers Hickman and Jones are dispatched to the Moxley property and confirmed Martha's death at 12:30 p.m. They are later joined by detectives Steve Carroll and Joe McGlynn and their captain, Thomas Keegan. Their investigation into Martha's murder begins at the brutal crime scene. Small blood spots were visible on the driveway, where Dorothy, John and a few others had walked past that morning. This led to 2 bigger pools of blood under a weeping willow tree. Martha's body lay face down under a pine tree, her head pointed towards the house, with bloody drag marks where she'd been pulled from the willow tree to be concealed underneath the pine. She had been beaten around the head with a golf club, a Tony Penner 6-iron, that had broken into 4 pieces, one of which had been used to stab her through the neck. Martha's windpipe had been cut, and her skull was split. She had a broken nose, and numerous gouges and fractures to her face. Pieces of the golf club were found at the scene, but the final piece, the handle, was missing. Martha was nude from the waist down. The jacket she was wearing, a navy LL Bean, was still on, but her jeans and her underwear had been pulled down to her ankles. There was a smeared palm print on her thigh, which indicated an attempt had been made to open her legs, but there was no other indication of sexual assault. There was so much blood that her naturally blonde hair looked red to the attending detectives. In her pocket was a pumpkin-shaped Halloween party invite. The police believed that on her route home from the Skakels, Martha had walked across their driveway, across Walsh Lane, and onto her driveway, where an assailant struck Martha with a golf club, at which point Martha ran, and likely somewhat disorientated from the first blow, only made it about 40 feet when she was hit again under the willow tree at the edge of the property. She was hit between 10 and 12 times about the head with a golf club, which either shattered during the attack or more likely was snapped deliberately by the killer to allow them to stab her in the neck. Martha was then dragged from the willow tree to the pine tree, where she was concealed from view until Sheila Maguire made her way into the garden. Further injuries had been caused to Martha from being dragged under the tree. She had scratches on both hips and down her thighs and on her face. Pine needles were embedded in her skin. The killer then left the scene with the handle of the golf club, which was never recovered, and given the behaviour of the dogs in Walsh Lane, it is suspected that the killer ran down the road towards Puget Sound and dumped the last piece of the golf club there. Martha's time of death was estimated to be between 9:30pm and 5:30am, based on the autopsy report, which we will talk about in the next episode. Police narrowed this to shortly before 10pm, based on witness reports about the reactions of the dogs. The Ix dog and another neighbourhood dog were among the animals barking loudly at this time, and both dogs were directly facing the willow tree where Martha was killed. The location of the body and the nature of the attack indicated that Martha had known her assailant and that they were familiar with the area, but the police were concerned about outsiders sneaking into Belle Haven and the proximity of Interstate 95. Greenwich police were not equipped to handle this type of case. The last murder in Greenwich prior to Martha was in 1949, and although the mystery was solved, a series of unfortunate events led to the culprit going on the run. Police experience is nearly always a deciding factor in the success of cases like this. Complex investigations require expert training and experience, but even experienced detectives have not always been involved in this type of murder investigation. In most murders, there is an obvious connection between the victim and the perpetrator, and most of the police work is to build a solid case connecting the perpetrator to the crime. Whereas in a complex murder investigation, there is often no obvious suspect or any information as to why or how this occurred, and the police develop strategies and lines of inquiries to try and identify the culprit. As every murder inquiry is different, even the experienced officers who've dealt with this type of offence before may have to come up with a completely new way of approaching a similar case. Greenwich in 1975 is a small town where crime isn't particularly common, and this was a murder investigation that was more of an Agatha Christie whodunit kind of mystery than a straightforward domestic killing. They were not going to be equipped to handle this investigation. So I just wanted to get that out of the way before we talk about the investigation, because there's been a lot of criticism of the police. And in fact, a couple of journalists have really looked at whether there was corruption involved, because when we get into it later, you'll see that due to the high-profile nature of some of the suspects, the idea that investigations were shut down and people weren't helpful, or the police or even the prosecution was infiltrated, has been raised and flagged. And I would say that I would agree with some people's commentary that actually it's less about corruption and more about incompetence. I say that with no disrespect to Greenwich Police, because they did eventually solve the case, but the initial investigation was marred by a few different problems, and one of them was the fact they'd never dealt with a case like this before. Another issue was the lack of physical evidence. Greenwich Police had none of the forensic investigation that we would expect to see in a murder investigation today. 1975 forensic investigations were mostly blood grouping, and it would be another 20 years until DNA was at the heart of inquiries. To put this into context, those of you who are familiar with Mindhunter, the incredible Netflix show, that they cancelled, and yes, I am still bitter about it. For those of you who've seen it, you'll know that around the time of Martha's murder, John Douglas, who the character Holden Ford is based on, he was the creator of the Crime Classification Manual, and he was in Quantico with his team developing the FBI's understanding of violent crime and coining terms such as serial killer and categorising different types of murder and offenders. The wider police network were not even privy to those discussions and research, much less in the habit of applying them to violent crime. To be fair, the Douglas team, or the FBI Behavioural Science Group, did assist in Martha's murder later on, but we'll get to that. But for now, Greenwich Police are left with the old school methods of detection. Interviews, door-to-door inquiries, check alibis and compare statements, which was made almost impossible by the fact that they were lied to consistently by two of the suspects. Without any information or evidence to push back against what they were being told, they had to take what was being said at face value. The lack of experience Greenwich Police had, and the mystery that surrounded Martha's death, could derail the investigation. And someone who was quick to realise this was John McCreet, a colleague of David Moxley's at the consultancy firm. On hearing about the death of Martha, John immediately contacted Mr. Moxley to advise him to get a private investigator and offered to help with doing so. John McCreet had worked with Detroit police on changing their department to better tackle the growing homicide rate, and knew how hard complex crimes were, even for detectives who lived and worked in a violent city and were used to solving such crimes. Greenwich Police did receive support from Detroit Police during the investigation, and we will talk more about that in the next few episodes. But Mr. McCreet was already concerned. He knew that the first few days of an investigation were vital and urged David Moxley to move quickly on this. At the time, Mr. Moxley was in shock and grief and understandably was not in the right mind to hire someone. He also trusted the police to be able to handle the investigation, and despite McCreet's warnings, he did not pursue any outside help. A decision he would come to regret. "We are in trouble," he told John McCreet only a few weeks later. Just how much trouble they were in will be explored in episode 2, where we are looking at the aftermath of Martha's death and the police investigation in detail. But that's it for today. Thank you for listening to True Crime with Morty. Please like, comment, subscribe, and join us for next week's episode, where we will continue with the mystery on Walsh Lane. Until next time, goodbye from me and goodbye from Morty.